Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot Podcast. I am thrilled to welcome Derek Porter to the podcast. Derek is the assistant head of middle school at Green Hill School, and I have really had the pleasure of reading Derek's information over on LinkedIn for the last year or so. He talks a lot about a topic that I thought about, which is burnout. It's certainly something that I've experienced earlier in my career, and it's something that I love to have open conversations about because it's one of those things that the more you talk about it, the more you can process it and work through it. And Derek's here today to help us with some of that work, and really excited to dig into the conversation. But before I do that, Derek, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm really glad to be here.
It's a pleasure. I'm excited to get into this conversation. But before we do, can you start by introducing yourself and your work at Green Hill School?
Yeah, so this is my second year in Texas. I was born and raised in Minnesota, came here by way of Virginia, where I was at an all boys Episcopal school for 11 years. I worked in a center for the study of boys there and did a lot of research to kind of cut my chops through William and Mary and everything else. I was hired here at Green Hill really to do equity and inclusion work. And that's been phenomenal. I've been able to learn so much as a relatively new practitioner. And now I'm moving into divisional leadership. And so I always try to name the hats that I'm wearing as I'm working with people, because the last 2 years has really been about establishing psychological safety, trying to be a trusted person, especially for the adults on campus.
Yeah.
A lot of what I do is professional development for them. And then now being moving into a space where I'm more of a supervisory role, right? And it's a little bit more evaluative in nature. And I've noticed some emotional kind of social shifts around that. But a lot of the work that I do, whether it's at Green Hill or beyond, it's really at that intersection of leadership, culture, organizational design, and kind of zooming in between institution, interpersonal management, and then even the individual. I think a lot of times in education, we don't do enough metacognition and people don't have enough protected time to reflect on their practice and grow.
So how did you begin to center in on burnout? Like what drove you there, and do you think this is something that's particularly acute right now in independent schools?
I think it's something that is a human phenomenon that's always been true.
Yeah.
I think people are defining and kind of redefining that language. I know for some practitioners, they're trying to move away from burnout and trying to do like a positive framing on it and thinking about employee engagement, right? Climate surveys. They're trying to move from kind of culture fit to culture add, right? This idea that we're not really squeezing people into established roles, but we're saying what can people bring to redesign these spaces. And so I think that's a lot of the work. I mean, for me, I think it's not being heard. I was at a space kind of earlier in my career. When you hit that 3 to 5 year mark, it can be pretty substantial. And I was finding myself asking questions about, do I matter? Is the work that I'm doing getting through to students? And I think in independent schools where we don't do standardized testing, how do I really know that I'm taking a student from wherever they start to wherever I want them to be? And then how do we kind of design that across sections, across departments, vertically and horizontally? So when I started asking those questions to senior admin, truly, Peter, they listened to me. They were very understanding one on one. They were curious, but nothing changed, right? And so in the end, I felt like it was a little bit of gaslighting there, and it drove me into my pursuit for my doctorate.
Yeah. And so talk more about your doctorate.
My doctorate is in action research as a form of professional development. And action research is a framework that helps teachers be practitioners and study the work that they do. It helps them elicit student feedback from like a growth mindset perspective, and it helps them to fail safely, right? To try something new in the room, and maybe you get the results you expected, maybe something better. Maybe it doesn't work and you thought it would be amazing, but you're kind of going beyond your own individual convictions and knowledge that you might have on campus. You're looking at relevant research, and then you're trying something that you found that kind of bubbled up for something gnarly that's going on in your space. So that was good. I got to really evaluate that program and to see if it was effective from people who are alumni of that space. And then I just took it on the road, went around to Learning Forward. You probably know about that conference and some other spaces, and just continue to kind of present and talk about that work.
Yeah. So how did you start to talk about burnout too? Like what drew you to that topic?
Yeah. So when I made the transition from my previous school in Virginia to Texas, I think that's what precipitated this
Mm,
because I've always presented at a lot of different conferences, regionally and nationally, but it was always under some other institutional guise. I was never really having kind of intellectual freedom or even kind of protecting my own intellectual property. And so that's something I wanted to do. And I wanted to do that through consulting and coaching. And so it was like, where to start? What is the topic that I feel like I can be expert on and have some authority in? And I started with my own story. I haven't been at some of these higher levels of institutional senior leadership. I haven't been a senior administrator, right? And so some of my ideas might not carry there, but what I did have was my lived experience. And so I thought, let me just talk about what I know. And that quickly led to finding a lot of colleagues who are in this space and thinking about teacher retention, thinking about the sustainability of that work.
yeah.
The National Association of Independent Schools had some great stuff about employees of color. And a lot of my, especially female mathematic colleagues of color, were really struggling to be retained in independent schools. And so I just started in my own backyard, in my own experience, and in my own community, and it's flowed from there.
How would you define burnout? Like if you were having a conversation like, "Ah, I'm, like, I'm struggling right now. I think I might be burned out." Like, if but I don't know. Like, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the human level answer, and then there's probably the research level answer, and maybe the answer somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Um, Maslach, who's the leading researcher on burnout, she has a framework and it makes it really simple to kind of have the conversation. She offers three pieces to it. Part of it is the depersonalization, where now you're starting to be suspicious and skeptical of your leader. And when you find yourself, the person who hired you when you were going in that interview space, you might recognize that energy and it might really mismatch with the person that you are now and how you feel being coached by whoever your direct supervisor is. And that can be one of your signals. I think the most obvious part is the emotional layer. I think that people kind of see the emotional sadness or anxiety right off the top. That's pretty easy. And then the last piece, I think, is the most subtle. It's really this idea that I'm losing faith in myself. And that's
Mm,
kind of what I spoke to in my own experience. I was starting to question if I matter, right? And that talker, that gremlin that goes in your own mind, that's really hard to discern and distinguish by yourself. And so if someone was really wondering for themselves, I would wonder, are they in therapy? Do they have a coach? Who's their mentor? What is
yeah.
their spouse saying? Right? You have
Yeah.
to go to the people who are in their inner circle, who they have enough trust built up with to kind of ask some of those harder questions to really see if this is something that can be restored through self-care, right? Like, can I drink more water? Can I exercise? Is it diet? Can I get more sleep? Versus burnout is something that you can't just sleep, exercise, or drink water your way out of. You can't just buy a puppy, right? There's no amount of pizza parties,
I know puppies are pretty great.
they are, they
Yeah.
are. But when we talk about burnout, it's something
Yeah.
pretty chronic.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think too much of the conversation has been put on the motivational self-care part and not the systems alignment or misalignment part of the conversation.
Yeah, I remember when I was really feeling that sense of burnout, everything was heavy.
Yeah.
Like my eyes were heavy, like just my head felt heavy, everything felt heavy just because I couldn't I was just tired. I was really tired and it was something I'd never experienced before. I've never had that kind of sensation, but
Mm,
I knew I needed to change something. It wasn't, the path that I was going down wasn't sustainable. I had to figure it out.
that's good. I think that that's really powerful. I mean, no, I'll just leave it at that. I completely agree, Peter.
Yeah.
I can relate to that for sure.
Talk a lot about the school business model. Obviously, it's a big part of this podcast and the series. And one of the areas that I always dive into is, it independent schools are facing more competition than they've ever faced before. There's so many school options, right, for families. They've never had this many options, and particularly in areas where maybe the birth rate declines are really starting to show themselves. Like you have fewer kids and a lot more options. Now, if you're in Texas or in Florida, a lot of people have been moving in. It's a different conversation. I fully recognize that. But
Mhm.
what we've done, and understandably so, is like, okay, we have to differentiate. We have to be competitive in the market. So we need to add more programs. We need to add more things to to really separate ourselves and make our value proposition match with the tuition that we're asking parents to pay for. Because at the end of the day, when a parent writes a check every year, for a lot of parents,
Mhm.
it's the biggest check they're writing all year. But it also comes with the expectations that the child is going to have some sort of transformational outcome,
Yes.
academic, social, athletic, art in the arts. It could be any number of things. And so what I have seen, and I'm curious like to get your reaction to this, is does this additive culture where we just keep adding more things and we're not particularly good at taking things away. Like sunsetting is not necessarily something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. And there's a whole nother conversation around that.
Mhm.
But do you think this is contributing to people feeling overwhelmed? Like, is there a pattern that you're seeing? Is there a cost from kind of leaning into an additive culture?
I love the framing because I agree. I think a lot of this work comes from a really good place. I think a lot of schools are recognizing they can't just live off the strength of their reputation. A lot of schools are rethinking kind of the grandfathered in admissions process where it's like, oh, only all because, you're a legacy student and your parent or family has a relationship. We can't guarantee you a spot, which is really hard conversations for a lot of the admissions people I deal with. And so
Mm,
I think it's coming from a really good place from an equitable standpoint, from a programming standpoint. But absolutely, I mean, the decision fatigue alone of what you just said that some heads of school and boards are trying to balance is
yeah.
insane. It's really challenging. From my work in research, I just talk about cognitive load theory as just another way of framing this. Because when we think about that, it's like, okay, so how much should we really carry? What's appropriate? And so having this way of thinking about it is really important. For those who might be a little less familiar, cognitive load theory, it's another one of these frames that has three parts. I do that for me to just make it really easy to remember, really,
Mhm.
quite frankly. The first part is that intrinsic load, and that's like how much brain capacity does it take to actually do the job, right? In our schools, they're really complex systems. Our teachers have to be really smart. You have to know your content. You have to have classroom management. Like there is an intrinsic load to being a good, effective, independent school teacher or leader. The next part is actually the germane load, which is what a lot of us are pursuing. That's the deep thinking. I think a lot of our leaders don't have protected time on their calendar to do the deep thinking. They're waiting for that quarterly retreat. They're waiting for that kind of July quiet month to be able to really get in there and set vision and do the deeper work. I think we need to find smarter ways to do that quicker, that is a little bit more responsive in real time. And then the last part is where the cut happens, Peter, and that's the extrinsic load. Like, what's all the extraneous noise that's distracting from signal?
Yeah.
Where are we not getting to mission? I think with a lot of our new programs, they aren't necessarily mission aligned. They might be aligned with some other priority, but how do we make sure that all of the threads and all of the departments and all of the people on campus that we're onboarding are tethered in and tied in and feeling some sense of connection and tie to mission fulfillment? And anything that's not, we have to have the courage to sunset that program so that we can move that bandwidth, that literal cognitive human load bandwidth in the most kind of efficient, productive path.
So if we're not doing that, I mean, if there's an example of a school that maybe isn't necessarily seeing it and being like, oh, we've got to like sunset in order to protect cognitive load. Um, how does that work from a systematic point of view? Because like certainly as an individual, you can feel burnout, but the question is it also being driven by the system that they're in? Is it like the organizational structure, the policies, procedures, all the different things? So like, how do you separate those two things? And I mean, I guess, does it even matter? Like, when a school's trying to address it, like what should they be looking for?
I think anything that's not acknowledged, you have to wonder, why are we doing it?
Mm,
And so, for example, there's going to be recognition spaces where people are giving kudos, where people kind of have had an opportunity to exceed expectations and they get acknowledged, right? In the big auditorium in front of everyone, or in kind of your private coaching or professional development platform. If what someone's literally doing with your institutional time is not something that we would write up recognize, acknowledge, or compensate with a stipend, then you have to question those things first, right? All of the volunteer work, all of the extras and the add-ons, all of those other duties as assigned. I think we just did something actually with our HR department where they looked at every stipended role and they asked the people who are currently serving in those roles, what do you do?
Mm.
Because maybe we don't fully understand what that is. And maybe some people are undercompensated. Maybe some people are overcompensated. But I'm in E&I, right? That's the primary lens that I'm coming from with it. And so even just thinking about where we invest our kudos, our praise, our dollars, our time, I think you start looking at it in terms of just concrete, almost a quantitative point system like that as just an easy way into that conversation.
So that you can measure, okay, this person's at risk right now.
Oh, absolutely, because I think some people are working really hard and they feel completely unseen.
Yeah. It's interesting when we did, we talked ahead of the pod and we were doing some prep. You had mentioned that the person who's actually regulated, not burned out, they risk being ostracized in a culture built around like this shared sense of overwhelm.
Yes.
So I was super curious about that. But I guess my
Yes.
question is, what does that say about the culture we've built and how do you shift it?
I think most people are familiar with the game Whack-A-Mole. It's this idea that someone
Yeah.
pops up just
Right.
a boom.
Right.
And when I think that's what you create a reactive culture where the squeaky wheel gets the grease, which means the person who's loud, whether it's parent, faculty, whatever, you have to make noise to be compensated, right? In terms of your salary, you have to negotiate, you have to send that email, you have to set up that meeting. And so if you have a system like that, which isn't the only way to evaluate someone's contribution to an organization. I think we see that especially across industries.
Yep.
But I think in independent schools, evaluation has become a really difficult word. But I'm kind of seeing it as a proactive way of giving people opportunities to grow, which a lot of our educators want to do, and an opportunity to kind of receive that affirmation, which reduces that burnout, right? You know that you matter.
Yeah.
And we're actually coming to you not just because you're complaining, not because you use a digital suggestion box that you thought was anonymous, right? Um, and not that we're reacting to anything that you said in a particular space, but we're coming to you because that's part of how the system does this work. Like that's part of our commitment to you.
How do you think we've gotten to a place where evaluation has a negative connotation? Like, where do you think that comes
Mm, this is my perspective. I think it's a
from?
training gap. I work with a lot of talent development professionals, and when you see kind of corporate America and how training is done at a big institution that might have 70,000 employees, it's very different to kind of the relational centered, human centered work that we're doing in our independent schools. And again, that's a big plus. I think it's coming from a wonderful, well intentioned place. I think we try to be family centric and family first. I think there's a lot of soft skills that we really appreciate that we don't train people on.
Yeah.
Right? And so, how can we be more intentional with what we're training for? I think a lot of our independent schools might have, for example, pillars of teaching excellence, right? Some type of kind of generic doc that says these are our core principles, these are our core values, and we want to see them lived out in your classroom. But how many of our schools have an actual like walk-through rubric where whoever's observing you, they have kind of look for it's like, hey, when I'm coming through, because of this pillar that we have, this is something I'm going to be looking for in your classroom. And we're going to do goal setting around these pillars. And we're going to, kind of doing this kind of coaching model. I think some of that intentional, very precise training is lacking. I think public schools have outpaced independent schools in that type of frame.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of what you said just resonates with me, and I think a lot. I think I've thought a lot about this over the years in terms of how evaluation should be a real positive opportunity for growth. And I think part of the challenge with evaluation is that it happens over very, very long time frames, right? So like maybe once a year you're evaluated, or
Yeah.
maybe if you're lucky, it's twice a year. But really, you need that ongoing evaluation because it's like you, I use the word coaching. I mean, it's like how can we be better? Right? Like we need that feedback is so important. And as well as training the evaluator so that there's consistency across the board and that they have the skills that
Mhm.
they can bring to
Mhm.
that role. I mean, there's a like you said, it's very, very complex, right? It's not just, checking things on a piece of paper. It's like there's a whole art, science and art to it as well.
That's right. And so how many of our administrators receive those trainings on a particular framework that our whole school is going to adopt? I think schools are very intentional about adapting frameworks to fit their particular school mission,
Mm,
but then you can lose out on something. One kind of concrete example that I see time and time again in my work is restorative practices. Restorative practice from like a discipline kind of model is a very specific thing. There are specific organizations you can get certified as kind of a restorative practitioner or trainer. But I found very few independent schools that want to adopt the whole thing. They might like a piece of it. They might want to do the circles, but not the rest of it.
yeah.
And so I think one of the challenges at an independent school is how we kind of piece everything together, which is our freedom, right? That's part of what makes us independent. We can kind of have that freedom to pick and choose,
Yeah.
but then you lose from a system standpoint. You're not using a system, right? There's not going to be fidelity.
When you say restorative practices, like define what you mean by that.
Exactly. And that's sorry. That's the rub that I find with a lot of senior admin and people who use this language. And, restorative practice is just one example. We could take a lot of them, but I think they're thinking about how do we make our discipline system not one that's punitive,
Mm,
but one that's inclusive and prioritizes belonging so that no matter who makes a mistake, there's a way for people to say, ouch, for a way for someone to say, I hear you, for a way for someone to consider their intent and impact, and for a way for that conversation to lead to an amends where the community can move forward in a way that's healthy, right? Without labeling bias, without retaliation, right? Without escalation and things like that.
well, I'm curious, when you think about burnout, I know you think about it becoming a belonging problem. Like, explain that. Like, talk about your framing there.
Yeah, I think burnout is when you really see that you're not a part of the community anymore.
Mm,
Whether from an emotional standpoint, you just don't have it in you and showing up and getting out of bed is really hard. Or from a cynicism standpoint, you see the vision, you hear the ideas from the front of the room, but you think it's not for you. They're talking to someone else. You don't trust it to actually take these things and bring it back to your advisory. you know, I think it goes right down to the actual ground because we have to remember senior admin, they only get their work done through other people. If senior admin care about student outcomes, then their number one thing is activating and upskilling teachers.
yeah.
Support, right? To be an administrator should be in a support role. And so if you have teachers then, right, actual student facing professionals who are burnt out, that's going to be a huge block, a huge barrier
Yeah,
to
for sure.
student outcomes and impact.
If you were to look at a school and say, "Oh, they're like really dialed in and they really burnout resistant," what
Mm.
does that look like in practice? Like, and what kind of changes should a school be thinking about to get to that ideal state?
Yeah, I think anything that you can do that will increase engagement is really important. I think the hardest thing, like a pitfall, a common pitfall, would be trying to make your decision making more flat or trying to make your leadership structure more flat. I think people assume that having a hierarchy is going to lead to more burnout, but I haven't found that to be the case. I don't see it in the research. I think sometimes leaders think that they're being more effective by mining the room and by making decision making more of a democratic process. But usually it ends up being too many cooks in the kitchen, and you have a little bit of decision paralysis in situations like that. And so, what I highly recommend is like clear leadership that makes decisions and goes in a direction, but that models apology for mistakes, right? That models imperfection, that models making difficult choices and kind of sharing the praise, but then falling on the sword when things go left. I
Yeah.
think that type of leadership model, which I feel like is pretty traditional actually and pretty classic,
Hmm.
is something that we need a little bit more of kind of in our independent school spaces, because it gives people a direction and a vision to go after. And honestly, that makes a humongous difference when we think about burnout and burnout prevention.
But I imagine that also means that you have to be really good at listening, right? Like, for the decision to really resonate, like people have to be heard.
That's no, I think that's really, really good, because we're assuming that these leaders are going to be data informed, that they're going to be community informed, right? We're assuming that these people aren't just living in the bat cave making their
Right.
decisions, but they're leading from within a community of people, and that they have those other structures in place where they can hear from a committee. When they're hiring, there's a committee, right? But those people who are on these committees are making recommendations or are offering feedback from a particular stakeholder group.
Right.
In my current role, we have a family inclusion council, an employee inclusion council, a student inclusion council. So there's lots of representative spaces, but none of those members are in the other spaces. And so if you're the person who's the director and you have to make a decision based on all of this information,
Right.
you have to be able to do that. You can't just keep bringing feedback and cross-pollinating the groups. You have to be able to take that and show something operational and take action on a strategic plan.
Yeah, but having the right structure in place is, I think, is one of the is a big opportunity here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Derek Porter, this has been great. If somebody wants to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Definitely via LinkedIn would be a great way to stay in touch. Just Derek Porter, search me up.
Perfect. And you have a Substack too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I try to write and get articles out several a month.
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure to link to everything in the show notes. But Derek, this has been terrific. I really do appreciate it. And for those of you in Moonshot Lab, hang tight. We've got the extended interview coming up. But again, Dr. Derek Porter, Assistant Head of Middle School at Green Hill School. Thank you. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Peter.